Good evening. I'm Eric Bierbaum, Assistant Professor of Government and Social Studies and Director of Graduate Fellowships at the Software Center for Ethics. And it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce A. John Simmons, Commonwealth Professor of Philosophy and Law at the University of Virginia. Professor Simmons' work brings extraordinary clarity to topics that are often discussed, but not often very illuminatingly discussed until he's gotten his hands on them. He's made seminal contributions to our thinking about rights, John Locke's treatment of consent, our role in associational obligations, witness his devastating attack on simple appeals to the role morality of practice, and most recently he's taken on the topic, the thorniest topic perhaps in recent political theory, of non-ideal theory, a topic that our graduate fellows have grappled with this year in the seminar. Simmons is the author of Moral Principles and Political Obligations on the Edge of Anarchy, and Is There a Duty to Obey the Law, For and Against? As you know, he unhesitantly says, no, there is no duty to obey. This makes it all the more surprising that he taught ethics as a special consultant at the FBI National Academy for several years, although it would be more intriguing to know how much of his avowed anarchism was known to the feds at the time. Simmons' philosophical anarchism is not the bomb-throwing kind, as you might imagine. Indeed, what is distinctive about his version of it is that its judgment of state legitimacy does not translate into any immediate requirement of our opposition to illegitimate states. He treats legitimate states as an independent moral variable along with other moral qualities they might possess, and his defense of it doesn't come across as you'd expect from an anarchist. The tone is always understated and exceptionally clear. He describes his view as less obviously flawed, quote, than other available views. Yes, on his view, we live in an illegitimate state, though for him it's nothing personal. No existing state, no state in the history of the world has ever passed muster. There's a glimmer of hope, though, in Simmons' view. Unlike anarchists who find the very concept of legitimate authority incoherent, Robert Paul Wolff, for example, he leaves open the possibility of living in a legitimate state. We just need a few more years or perhaps centuries of the kind of work that the Software Center lab is working on to get a little closer to full legitimacy status. So there's the old line in academics that people work on areas that reflect their own intellectual or otherwise vices. But I can say that despite having attacked the principle of fair play in print, Simmons has played very fair with his critics. Despite his resistance to arguments from role morality, he's been a committed citizen and former chair of Virginia's program in political and social thought. And notwithstanding his anarchism, he is not much of a jaywalker. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Simmons, who will be lecturing on democratic authority and the boundary problem.
Now, am I supposed to use both of these microphones? Is that the idea? Or is that one adequate? Can people hear me now? Yep. Okay, thanks very much, Eric, for that kind introduction. And thank you for arranging weather that's exactly like Central Virginia. It's a special pleasure to get to talk to this particular audience because it contains three of my most influential teachers who may or may not want to take credit for this, but I'll point them out so that they feel obliged to pretend they want to take credit for it at least. David Lyons was my main guy and dissertation supervisor at Cornell. That dissertation, with a few additions, became my first book, which is miraculously still in print. A lot of people say it's the best thing I ever wrote, which suggests a very disappointing career trajectory. And Tim Scanlon is here as well. It was his ethics course, which I took as a freshman at Princeton, that first interested me in pursuing philosophy. It also caused me to quit the engineering school and dash my parents' dreams of having an affluent son. And Dennis Thompson taught me my first course in the history of political theory, which began my interest in the political side of philosophy and its history. It's also the class in which I developed my lifelong dislike of Sammy Alito, with whom I nearly came to blows outside the classroom building one day. My talk for today is a cut down and reorganized version of a much longer piece. I hope that this works. If it doesn't, it at least gives me the opportunity to respond to questions by saying that I answer those in the longer version. Those who know my work will recognize some familiar themes in this talk. I hope they are better developed and more persuasive than people have found them in the past. Okay, modern states are territorial entities. Indeed, they're defined in international law as entities with fixed territories. And states, of course, claim rights with respect to those territories, rights that I think divide naturally into three rough groups. In the first group, states claim a set of rights of territorial jurisdiction, that is, rights to be the ultimate maker and enforcer of law for all those who are physically within the territory, rights to wield legal and political authority over the territory and its occupants. Second, states claim rights to exclusive control of the movement of persons and things across the borders of their territories. And third, states claim rights to exclusive control over the natural resources contained in or constituting their territories. Cosmopolitan theorists have recently expressed a lot of skepticism about states' claims with regard to borders and with regard to natural resources. I want to focus on the first of these kinds of claimed rights, the right of territorial jurisdiction, the right to exercise authority over people within the boundaries of the state's territory. And in particular, I want to call attention to a difficulty that I believe infects what is currently the most popular type of theory of justified territorial sovereignty, the problem I'll call the boundary problem. It's been called that before. And the type of theory that I believe can't plausibly solve this pretty basic problem is any theory that is purely functionalist or structuralist in nature. That is, any theory that grounds the state's legitimacy solely in its successful performance of its morally mandated functions, or that grounds its legitimacy solely in the structure of its basic institutions. Theories of that sort tend to be either broadly Kantian or broadly consequentialist. I'll focus here on Kantian theories, those being less easy to dismiss out of hand. Indeed, I think Kantian theories enjoy very, very wide support today. By Kantian theories, I mean not just Kant's own or those like Kant's, but also Rawls' theory and Rawlsian theories, along with virtually all of the current crop of theories of democratic authority. So it's a substantial tradition that I'm aiming at here. I guess this counts as the contemporary heartland of that tradition, so it may not be too bright to be taking that as my target, but here we go. We are, I take it, all perfectly familiar with critiques of structuralism within the debates, the traditional debates about distributive justice. Robert Nozick, for instance, famously wrote that, quote, "Most persons do not accept current time slice principles, what he elsewhere calls structural principles, as constituting the whole story about distributive shares. They think it relevant in assessing the justice of a situation to consider not only the distribution it embodies, but also how that distribution came about," unquote. Many of us reacted to that claim, I suspect, by saying or thinking that most persons also don't think that historical considerations constitute the whole story about justice, as Nozick, in fact, ends up insisting that they do. Both historical and structural factors seem to most of us relevant to determining what counts as a just distribution of property, say. That someone labored to produce a good seems relevant to assessing her claim to it, as does the fact that she has far more than she needs, while others in her society struggle to survive. Nozick, we might say, overreacted to what he saw as Rawls' privileging of structural factors in his theory of justice by just as mistakenly privileging the historical. Theories of political authority and territorial jurisdiction can similarly locate the source of states' or governments' rights in either structural features of states, for instance, in the justice of their distributive institutions or in their democratic constitutions, or in historical facts about how they acquired their control over persons and territories. And here I suspect, again, many people think that both structural and historical considerations are relevant to a proper understanding of the boundaries of states' authority. Whether a state acquired its control through bloody conquest or through willing participation by all involved seems important to the extent of its legitimate authority, as does the structure of the institutions through which it exercises that control. It is this kind of pluralism in our account of territorial authority that I think is resisted by the Kantian tradition in political philosophy. And without that kind of pluralism, I don't think we can give a plausible account of the proper boundaries of political and legal authority. Following Rawls, some Kantians say that we have a natural duty of justice to support and comply with those just institutional structures that apply to us. Or following Kant more directly, some Kantians say that in order to avoid being unjust threats to those around us, in order for all to enjoy not merely provisional rights, we must accept the authority of the justice administering institutions that are at work where we happen to find ourselves. Either way, it is structural or functional factors, the justice of or the justice administering functions of the political institutions of our countries of residence that do all of the labor in standard Kantian theories of political authority and territorial jurisdiction. Let me start with a quick state of nature story, which is designed to reveal the core Kantian reasoning about these issues. This comes pretty close, I think, to what Kant himself has to say about the matter. Suppose there are two clusters of people living at a considerable distance from one another in a condition of mere nature. The members of each cluster have little or no contact with those of the other, but are regularly brought into contact with those of their own cluster. Neither cluster constitutes a political society, let's say. The situation of persons located within each cluster will be at least inconvenient, if we believe Locke, possibly intolerable, if we believe Hobbes, or morally wrongful, as Kant thought. There is, of course, a natural solution to the problems of intra-cluster life. That's horribly awkward, isn't it? The members of each cluster could create a system for the mutual enforcement of their rights, for doing justice that would operate within but not between their clusters. Such a system would clarify what their rights are in an impartial fashion and be able to muster enough force to coercively impose that clarification. Such a solution would, in effect, permit the de facto districting accomplished by the arbitrary but willing gathering of persons into two clusters to be transformed into the de jure districting of two distinct systems for administering justice. Now imagine that as populations increase, the two clusters gradually grow together so that the people in the two clusters begin to regularly interact with one another. Perhaps then the two systems that are administering justice will reach some agreement as to how to handle intercluster problems, or perhaps the natural solution will be to combine the two districts into one, creating a single new district that's governed by a new internally consistent single system of justice. Now finally, suppose that all of the clusters everywhere expand and grow together so that population becomes more or less continuous across the face of the earth. People's new proximity to one another makes intercluster interaction and conflict a regular feature of their lives. Again, they might handle this by treaty, or once again, perhaps the more natural solution is to unite the various clusters under the authority of one internally consistent system for administering justice, and that would, of course, be the rough equivalent of a world state. Kant himself famously resisted this last step, as does virtually every contemporary Kantian political philosopher with whose work I'm familiar. They almost unanimously favor something like our actual world's multi-state solution, a solution featuring a plurality of roughly sovereign administrations for dealing with justice locally. But of course, in order to create a districted solution in a world of more or less continuous population, boundary lines between districts will have to be drawn in more or less arbitrary ways, or at least in ways no longer guided simply by natural facts about who will inevitably interact with whom. The actual history of districting and boundary drawing in the real political world, of course, is far beyond merely arbitrary in this way. It's been accomplished in most parts of the world through bloody-handed quests for resources and geographical advantages and simple expansions of dominion. Why, the question is, should we take the moral authority of existing states over their subjects or their territories to be determined by such a morally tainted process? Notice that this way of framing the boundary problem for the Kantian theory shows it to be a kind of second stage question within the theory. The first stage of the theory is designed to establish the moral necessity of the state and its system of justice, the moral duty on each person to leave the state of nature and submit to, or help create, and then submit to some districted political authority with its omnilaterally authorized determination and enforcement of people's rights. The justification for this first stage claim is taken by Kantians to lie in the moral necessity of persons possessing secure, conclusive, enforceable rights, which they allegedly cannot possess outside of the state, or in the requirement that all be subject to just distributive institutions. The failure to accomplish these goals puts all in a wrongful condition with respect to all others, making the creation or authorization of a state to do such work obligatory for all. I don't myself buy the first stage argument, but I'm going to accept it here arguendo. What I want to concentrate is on the required second stage of the argument. And once it's established that each has a moral obligation to enter a state and accept its authority, it must still be explained which state one is obligated to enter. Must we accept the dominion of whatever state claims our allegiance or is conventionally or legally determined to have authority over us? If so, which feature of the first stage argument secures that conclusion? May we instead opt to enter some other state, or perhaps better, join with others to create a preferred new just state of our own design? If not, this presumably cannot be because in doing so we would have failed to leave the wrongful condition of the state of nature or failed to subject ourselves to just institutions, insofar as multiple sovereign states are to be a permissible Kantian option. One state looks to be as good as another for first stage purposes. What's called for by the first stage of the argument is just membership in a functioning just state, not membership in any particular state, such as the one in which you happen to find yourself. Kantians thus seem to me to owe us an explanation of why the current conventional or legal division of the world into states with specific subject populations and territories should be thought to be the division that fixes mandatory moral boundaries of political authority and territorial jurisdiction. Jeremy Waldron, in a series of articles, tried to address this problem by appealing to what he called Kant's proximity principle. It is, Jeremy says, when we are unavoidably side by side with others, that we must enter with them, that is, specifically with those with whom we are side by side, into a civil condition. So what appeared at first to be a general duty merely to leave the state of nature, so that conclusive rights can be established as morality requires, now appears to be localized by the fact that, quote, those with whom I come into conflict will in the first instance be my near neighbors. It is my neighbors to whom I am a special threat. And since the systems attempting to administer justice to groups of us who are side by side are precisely those existing polities that currently claim our allegiance, the argument goes, we have a Kantian justification for the conservative solution to the boundary problem. Now, the claim that we're special threats to those with whom we are side by side seems to me plainly false. And who's a special threat to whom plainly depends on more than how close we are to them. It depends on our personal characters, our moral commitments, the social sentiments that do or don't tie us together. It depends on our offensive and defensive capabilities. It depends on the available technologies for delivering harm to distant others, and so on. But even if the falsity of the first premise weren't an issue, the argument could still not be plausibly characterized as offering us a convincing path to the conservative conclusion. In the first place, so long as boundaries need to be drawn somewhere in the world, in which population is virtually continuous over the face of the earth, there are indefinitely many ways to draw such boundaries that will respect the command to district people with those with whom they are side by side. And of course, the actual state boundaries that are the result of historical processes were neither intended to be guided by nor have otherwise conformed to the requirements of the Kantian argument. Residents of Honolulu are not exactly side by side with residents of Boston. though both do live on U.S. territories acquired by morally dubious means. They have that in common. We cannot, as Waldron sometimes does, simply add that what will matter will be which justice administering institutions have in fact been framed to deal with the claims of which persons, for the mere fact that a state names persons or territories as subject to its authority is not a morally interesting feature of the relation between persons and institutions. Germany can't acquire authority over the French simply by framing institutions designed to settle the conflicts between the residents of both countries. Nor will it do to add to this, as Waldron regularly does, the insistence that authority is only possessed by such justice administering structures that are effective in performing that task, because presumably we'd still object to German justice for the French, even if Germany somehow managed to administer justice effectively in some or all of France. But our objections would then be historical rather than functional or structural. They would refer centrally to the illegitimate seizure of territorial jurisdiction, not, at least not necessarily, to the fashion in which justice was administered by Germany. So it looks as if the Kantian argument still lacks a plausible solution to the boundary problem. Recent participants in the democratic authority wing of Kantian political philosophy, as I'll call it, have written as if it is democratic theory that provides the missing argument here. I have in mind here people like Dave Estlin, Tom Cristiano, Annie Stiltz Jeremy, of course, Scott Shapiro, Alan Buchanan, Henry Richardson, and a bunch of others. I will tar them all with one brush. So now our question becomes the more limited one of how we can identify the precise boundaries of the group or territory over which specifically democratic political authority can be legitimately exercised. While this seems to me to be the most basic problem facing a theory of democratic authority, it's a problem that was very rarely raised in the heyday of democratic theory. And even today, when we have people like David Miller and Bob Gooden writing about the problems involved in determining the proper boundaries of the demos, as Bob puts it, these authors are concerned primarily with the call to expand those boundaries beyond the uncontroversial cores of the citizenry of democratic nation states, say by extending the franchise to all whose interests are affected by democratic decisions. My concern, however, is with the prior question of how even persons and territories in that uncontroversial core can be taken to be legitimately subject to the authority of the state. That is, the worry here is not about who should be legally granted the franchise, but rather why even those who are granted it should be taken to be bound to comply with democratically authored decisions. The nature of the problem here for democratic theory is obvious. Democratic solutions to conflicts of interest or preference are plainly not naturally authoritative. This remains true even if we accept everything that's been written about the superiority of democratic procedures, either in intrinsic terms or in instrumental terms, right? That the students in my classes uniformly outnumber me, and so are capable of outvoting me on matters of class requirement doesn't make their regularly expressed preference for a lighter workload in any way authoritative. And it wouldn't do that if they set up a formal procedure for voting on the questions or elected representatives to do their voting for them. What they lack, of course, is the prior authority to impose on the class any procedure, democratic or not, for resolving disagreements in the group that consists of them plus me. Similarly, my club may not legitimately kidnap an outsider, confer membership and voting rights on him, and then simply impose on him the restrictions authorized by the majority of the club's members. The nature of the group, how one comes to be a part of the group, makes all the difference in whether or not any conflict resolution procedure can be authoritative for that group. The superiority of the conflict resolution procedure in question, however that might be determined, is straightforwardly irrelevant to that conclusion. I don't actually belong to any clubs. I will pretend that I do, so I'll pretend that I know about how clubs work. I'm imagining how they work. It might also be true that I wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have me, to bring in the other Marx into the discussion. The fact that democratic procedures are not naturally authoritative is, of course, what produces the boundary problem for theories of democratic authority. For precisely which collections of individuals do particular democratic procedures yield authoritative outcomes? If that question can't be answered by appeal to the structural superiority of democratic institutions to their rivals, how can it be answered within democratic theory? Take another hypothetical case. Imagine that, perhaps citing concerns about national security, the United States somehow managed to move its southern border barriers further south by several miles in the dark of night, declaring the newly enclosed territory to now be part of the United States. And suppose the United States then commenced to effectively and fairly administer justice in this new territory and extended full US rights, citizenship rights to all of the former Mexican residents of the territory. How should we understand the moral position of these newly minted US citizens? Are they bound to support and comply with the basic institutions of the United States, just as we take native-born US citizens to be? At least if we suppose, as I will for the sake of argument here, that the basic legal, political, and economic structure of the US is reasonably just and democratic. And how should we understand US territorial rights over these new territories? The question, notice, is not one of historic wrongs done by a state long ago in subjecting its claimed subjects and territories to state power, wrongs that might be said to have faded away or been superseded and to have no moral relevance now. That's actually the line that Jeremy Waldron takes. Rather, the question concerns a wrongful political subjection inflicted yesterday, let's say. Presumably, yesterday's wrongs cannot be said by today to have faded away without, in effect, simply saying that there are no moral rights or duties against unprovoked aggression. And some of the new US citizens might welcome their new status, since life prospects north of the border are generally better than those south of it. Others might feel wronged by the change for a variety of reasons. But regardless of the new citizens' feelings about the matter, the unilateral, unprovoked, coercive seizure by the US of the acknowledged territory and subjects of another sovereign state surely constitutes a clear wrong against that state and those subjects. And importantly, it constitutes a clear wrong according to the very same conventional or legal standards that purport to make it acceptable for the US to subject its other native-born citizens to its coercive authority. Is the appropriate response that this imagined aggression against Mexico would render the US government or laws, or render the US itself, unjust, and so owed no duties of support and compliance by its citizens? Or is it rendered unjust, but only with respect to the newly shanghaied citizens in the former Mexican territory? Neither can be true if justice is a purely structural, purely functional, non-historical matter. Nothing about the basic structure of the United States is necessarily altered simply by indefensible acts of state aggression. That the new citizens' wills are not reflected in the representatives or the laws to whose authority they're now suddenly subjected doesn't distinguish them from any native-born citizen who reaches adulthood in the state. What distinguishes them, of course, is the clear wrongs that have been done to the new citizens in forcibly including them in the group to be governed by a particular government and legal system. I submit that the natural moral conclusion to reach about this case is that the coercively subjected citizens are not bound by the democratically produced laws of their new country any more than the kidnapped member of my club is bound by the democratically produced rules of my club. It surely must be true, at least, that wrongs of illegitimate subjection limit the obligations that wrongdoing states can unilaterally impose on those they have wronged. Surely the fact that we've been wronged by others, and especially when they've wronged us in their efforts to forcibly impose the very obligations at issue, must leave us less fully obligated to them than we would be had we not been so wronged. I mean, that's just the same kind of rule we appeal to when we distinguish between the moral and legal consequences of, say, agreements made under duress and those made willingly. Historical considerations, in short, matter to the nature and extent of our obligations as citizens and to the nature and extent of the authority of our states. Mere institutional structures, including the institutions of democratic conflict resolution, can't do all the work that needs doing in explaining justified political authority and territorial jurisdiction. The peculiar feature of this criticism, of course, and a natural way to respond to it, is that virtually all Kantians would just agree that such forcible incorporation of innocence and territories through state coercion is a clear moral wrong against those citizens and against their home states. But the pure Kantian position can't consistently regard this as the kind of moral wrong which has, as a consequence, the forfeiture or the limitation of claims to political authority by aggressor states. To concede that would be to concede that historical considerations are, after all, relevant to determining the extent, that is, the legitimate boundaries of the political authority of existing states. And once that point is conceded, of course, the Kantian can no longer insist that the mere application to persons of just or justice administering institutions is sufficient to ground their political obligations or the legitimate authority over them of those institutions. And that concession would deprive Kantians of their simple, sweeping answer to questions about why the native-born are legitimately subject to the authority of states they never chose. Refusing to concede the point, though, leaves the Kantian with the extremely counterintuitive view that apparently illegitimate subjection makes no moral difference to the obligations of those so subjected to state power or to states' rights overseas territories. Those of you who know Annie Stiltz's work will know that she recently published in the journal Ethics a defense of a Kantian theory of territorial rights, and it proceeds just like her book, defending a Kantian political philosophy, and then suddenly gives up and introduces two historical principles that are designed to rule out the possibility of acquiring legitimate political authority by acts of unjust annexation or the expulsion of residents. So the Kantian argument goes along smoothly until the very end and then sort of gets surrendered to those historical points. I mean, this looks like a little point against the Kantian. I, of course, would like it to be the small point of a large wedge, opening the structuralist or functionalist door to other kinds of historical claims by other possible victims of illegitimate subjection to state authority, claims that we'd then have to individually analyze and resolve, not sweep away en masse by appeal to an exclusively structural theory of authority. In my view, for instance, we need to consider claims made by decimated Aboriginal peoples, claims that they too have been illegitimately subjected to state authority. Right? Those are claims that might justify the conclusion not only that reparations erode, but that the obligations of such subjects are at least much more limited than those of other citizens. And these same principles, I think, often apply in the case of nations suppressing or resisting secessionist and autonomy movements by groups that also claim to have been illegitimately subjected to their state's powers. The claims in many of these cases are not principally claims of structural injustice or functional failure in their states. The claim is often rather that the group was wrongfully made subject to that state in the first place. To respond to such complaints with offers of full democratic citizenship in a just state would appear to simply miss the point. The object of such movements is not just to secure the institutional rights guaranteed to other citizens of their states. It is instead to right the wrongs done them in the past, to be permitted the autonomy of which they were wrongly robbed, and to be compensated for those wrongs and their continuing effects. From what we've seen thus far, it would appear that Kantian political philosophy must either implausibly respond that such claims are without moral basis, or else admit the need for a more pluralistic approach to questions about political authority and territorial jurisdiction. Strikingly, the counter-arguments that are on offer in recent democratic theory don't appear to me to have any real traction on this problem at all. Scott Shapiro, for instance, argues in that big article on authority that's in one of the handbooks, guidebooks, companions, or something or other. I've forgotten which one it is now. Here's what he says, quote, "One who disagrees with the outcomes of a socially necessary, empowering, and fair procedure, like democratic decision-making, and thus disregards it acts, we might say, like a dictator. He unilaterally dictates the terms of social interaction to others and thereby exercises inappropriate control over the lives of his fellow citizens. Societies, he says, have a right to impose fair decision procedures, provided this is done under conditions of meaningful freedom," by which he means primarily rights for all of political franchise and free expression. So he says, disobedience to the democratic will amounts to an unreasonable arrogation of power. Tom Cristiano makes virtually the same argument in his recent writings on the subject. Now, it's easy to imagine contexts in which my insistence that collective judgments have no force for me does indeed look unreasonable or arrogant or perhaps even dictatorial if my imaginary club operates according to well-established procedures for resolving disagreements among its members, and if the outcome I favor is rejected in a fair application of those procedures, then it surely would look unreasonable or arrogant to insist nonetheless on the outcome that I had favored in advance. This would be especially true, and might then even appear to be dictatorial, to use Shapiro's language, if my unilateral intransigence undermined the outcome that was chosen by following the club's procedures and forced other people to do things my way instead. But the problem for democratic and other theories of authority that I've been talking about here is not one that can be effectively addressed by accusing non-compliers of arrogance or dictatorial conduct, for the problem at issue here is not one of justifying exercises of collective authority to those who are plainly legitimately included in the collective. It's rather the prior problem of determining who is legitimately included in the collective in the first place, and so who is legitimately subject to whatever conflict resolution procedure is utilized by the collective. It's the problem of determining who does and doesn't have the moral status analogous to my imagined kidnapped member of my club. And there's plainly nothing selfish or arrogant or dictatorial about the kidnapped party's insistence that the club's decisions have no authority over him, that he's not to be thought of as a legitimate member of the club at all. The other strategy that seems to be taken in recent democratic theory returns the focus to the apparently pre-districted nature of the tasks that exercises of political authority are designed to perform. Political authorities are charged with solving distinctive kinds of coordination problems, with preventing catastrophic social chaos, and so on. And those problems, while global, have to be solved locally. So Dave Estlund asks us to imagine a case in which a flight attendant, in her efforts to help the injured after a crash, begins telling the people around her how they should assist her in this task. Because it would be, he says, morally wrong not to agree to do as she says, someone who declines to agree is under her authority even without having consented. In this case, he says, non-consent to authority is null. And the catastrophe in question is districted, just as the social problems that political authorities must address are districted. So he concludes, quote, political authority is thus no more problematic than humanitarian duties, unquote. Kit Wellman has defended a view very much like this. Now, if we're asked why one individual or a small group of individuals must accept the authority of the state and comply with its commands, the answer presumably can't be that their failures to do so will create a crisis. Individuals and small groups in stable societies can't bring about instability by the mere refusal to comply or to accept the state's dictates as authoritative, unless they resort to conduct that is not only disobedient but deeply wrong on other grounds, such as acts of terrorism. Disobedience by individuals and small groups simply can't arrogantly or tyrannically dictate to the society how things will go. Estlund and Wellman both recognize this, and they introduce a fairness argument to explain why disobedience by individuals is nonetheless wrong. Disobedience to law treats unfairly the other members of the society who freely and cooperatively refrain from, as Wellman puts it, unilateral consumption of the good of discretionary disobedience, so disobeying when you feel like it. But such a response is simply a non sequitur. One can't be obligated to do one's fair share in a cooperative enterprise unless one legitimately counts as a member of the cooperating group in the first place. And that's precisely the districting question that this style of argument is designed to solve. So the argument simply begs the important question. It also fails to explain why we should think of familiar coordination problems and social emergencies as actually being subject to natural districting in conditions like those in most of the real world where population is more or less continuous. And instead of Estlund's single plane crash surrounded by a conveniently discrete group of possible helpers, we would have to imagine instead a tightly packed nightmare of multiple plane crashes in the midst of a continuous population. Right? Which flight attendant is then entitled to demand cooperation from which members of the surrounding undifferentiated population is a question with no obvious answer. If we're talking about moral authority and not just about grim political reality, it's certainly not obvious that the answer must be whatever the agencies with the most physical power declare the answer to be. The problem here for Kantian theories, I think, and for all functionalist and structuralist approaches, is that the principal focus of their justificatory arguments is purely inward, that is, taking the political units being analyzed as already given, the territorial boundaries and subject populations as established prior to the beginning of the argument, as if there were only one state or one territory or one body of persons in the world to consider. I mean, this approach is pretty explicitly adopted by Rawls at the beginning of A Theory of Justice, where he asks us to think of the society whose justice he's going to be discussing as what he calls a closed system isolated from other societies. And it's only after the theory of domestic justice is completed in Rawls, along with its companion theory of political authority and duties of compliance, that Rawls moves on to consider a world of multiple states and the law of peoples, that is, to govern relations between societies. And the reasoning leading to the law of peoples seems to me to proceed as if the units of persons and territories available for evaluation were already determined, and as if only ongoing or future structural or functional shortcomings in those units could disqualify them from legitimacy. Look, Rawls' international theory does, of course, forbid unwarranted state aggression of the sort I've been discussing. Rawls, like any reasonable person, regarded state aggression against innocents as morally wrong. But he cannot, I think, regard it as the kind of wrong that requires for its remedy any redrawing of or limitations on the political authority exercised within existing state boundaries. Existing states with their claimed territories and subjects are the starting point of the theory. No part of the law of peoples requires that states acknowledge or rectify their past wrongs of illegitimate subjection, even those wrongs that took place yesterday. If, however, we believe that states cannot gain legitimate political authority over persons and lands simply by having committed great enough wrongs, then our theory of political authority and political obligation must have an historical dimension. If I'm right in my basic claims here, one simply can't defend a plausible theory of domestic justice and legitimacy without first identifying the persons and territories that count as rightfully inside and rightfully outside a state's boundaries of authority. And this task requires that we have in hand an account of the moral boundaries between states and the moral boundaries between states and possible autonomous groups or persons. An account that isn't going to be plausible without being in some way sensitive to the wrongs that can be done in establishing territorial claims and subject populations. Others, of course, have argued that a theory of domestic justice can't, in the Rawlsian fashion, precede our international political philosophy, that the two have to be developed in concert. Right? That kind of argument is a commonplace among cosmopolitan theorists who see the claims of outsiders as imposing serious limits on what even domestically perfect states may do within their boundaries. Cosmopolitans have mostly focused, though, on secondary aspects of states' territorial claims. For instance, they've argued that states aren't entitled to exclusive control over the natural resources that good fortune just happens to have dumped in their territories. And they've argued that states aren't entitled to impose hard territorial borders, right? That they're instead obligated to open or soften their borders. My worry here, though, is about the primary and most basic kinds of claims that states make about territories and subjects, about their core claims to territorial jurisdiction. Some of my disagreement with functionalist and structuralist approaches to these issues undoubtedly rests on differences in how we're prepared to characterize ideal theory in political philosophy, that is, on just how ideal the relevant political ideal may be without its being dismissible as merely utopian. Rawls famously characterized the political ideal, which should be the object of ideal theory, as what he called a realistic utopia. And he explained this idea of a realistic utopia by quoting Rousseau, who proposed to proceed by, quote, taking men as they are and laws as they might be. I take it the idea is that we're to hold constant the relatively intractable features of human nature and the social world, and then Ideal theory should tell us within those constraints, as far as those limits permit, what's necessary in order to perfect the rightfulness of our political condition. And there is, of course, a clear sense in which Rawls did take laws and states as they might be, not as they are, since his ideal of domestic justice plainly requires all existing states to make substantial changes in their domestic institutional structures. But there's another clear sense in which Rawls stopped far short of imagining states as they might be, for he chose to take as his starting point, and so to grant prima facie legitimacy to, the existing conventional and legal sorting of persons and territories into the districts controlled by the various sovereign states. But states might, of course, be quite different than they are now in far more dramatic ways than can be accomplished simply by alterations to their domestic basic structures. And these far more dramatic differences could yield what seem to me to be obvious increases in the extent to which the system of multiple sovereign states constitutes a rightful condition. The extent of states' recognized sovereignty over both persons and territories might, in my view, be decreased to good moral effect, and states might be viewed as obligated to make more than feeble symbolic gestures to illegitimately subjected persons and the victims of past wrongs by states. If we're going to take laws as they might be all the way down, as it were, we must not, I think, stop without full justification at the level of merely internal structural requirements for justice. We must rather question also both the extent and the boundaries of existing states' authority and ask about the obligations that their histories impose on those states. Right? Might not a full political ideal require that states surrender or limit their control over wrongly subjected persons and territories, repair the injuries they've done? To acknowledge that, of course, requires that we acknowledge in ideal theory both the structural and the historical dimensions of existing states' authority. Most Kantian theories, though, write as if their theories can be structuralist or functionalist throughout. That is, the theory presupposes that societies are already appropriately districted, and the only question is whether the performances or structures of those districts meet muster. Rawls' international political philosophy, I think, is as purely structural and non-historical as his theory of domestic justice. It's focused only on the conditions that must be satisfied for societies as they are districted now to be members of a reasonably just society of well-ordered peoples. None of the principles of the law of peoples requires that past wrongs by states be corrected or that states' claim boundaries be subject to adjustment on historical grounds. If, as I believe, both more limited state sovereignty and greater state responsibility for wrongful historical acts would make for a morally preferable political world, a more rightful condition, then I think those requirements should be incorporated into the target ideal of political philosophy. States are, of course, violently jealous of their claims over territories and their authority over claimed subjects, so that requiring reforms like sharing resources and granting partial or complete autonomy to those wronged by state subjection to power will undoubtedly be difficult pills for states to swallow, but ideal theory should surely not be taken to be committed to specifying only easy political goals. There is, I recognize, a very real and contested question here as to where to draw the line between realistic utopianism and idle utopianism. But I'm confident that the correct place to draw this line can't be between an ideal that takes seriously only structural features of states and a competing ideal that also insists on taking seriously the history of states' actions in the world. It is not either idle or unrealistic to believe that both our domestic and our international political ideals should include a commitment to acknowledging and righting significant wrongs so far as doing so is within our power. Thanks.
I'll be keeping the cue. Perhaps Larry sensed the Kantian crossfire that I expect to come. You can activate your mic. That would start. Let's start with Francis.
I don't come from either political party, so I have two questions. One is the distinction between structural and historical. if the democratic theorists, at least, think of whether a particular law or arrangement of distribution of goods comes about by a democratic process within the society or not. I mean, they look to see the pedigree. Was it voted on or not? Now, that's a historical factor, and yet you included it into the structural component. So I'm wondering if the distinction between structural and historical is not as hard and fast, because I would have thought, if it's not a democratic pedigree, no matter how just it is, there's something wrong with it. That's part of the structural view that you described. So might it be the case that taking over states in a certain way, would violate a certain structure, given that we've already seen that there is an ambiguity in the use of the term structure, because it seems to incorporate some necessary pedigree for the sake of, law, legitimacy, and law within the state. So again, the idea is maybe, taking over a state or taking over a country, a territory, another territory, or including a member in an illegitimate way might be seen to be a comparable structural deficit. But the other question I had was about the notion of actual and historical. I mean, suppose it would have been permissible for me to bring that person into my group, but in actuality it was preempted by someone dragging him in. But if I had gotten there in time, it would have been quite appropriate and legitimate for me to take this person in. Now, is it the case that simply because, in actual fact, what brought them in was illegitimate, that's going to rule the roost? Or is it the fact, or is it at all relevant that we would have had a right to bring them in, so there's this counterfactual hypothetical contrast to the actual. So those are my questions.
Okay, let me see if I can remember both of them. So the first one had to do with vagueness in the distinction between structural and historical theories, right? What I had in mind was a distinction between the historical and the structural, where we're talking about the authority of the institutions themselves, rather than what goes on within the practice of the institution. So look, I mean, the kings, having said this is law, makes, in some sense, that theory of authority, the theory of regal authority, historical as well. But the question is, how did that structure of authority get imposed on the society in the first place? And is the mere existence of the structure what matters? Namely, that it's a structure of a certain sort, that it isn't regal authority, but is democratic authority? Or does something about the history of the imposition of that institutional structure on individuals matter to the extent of its legitimacy? So I wasn't supposing that the mere fact that there can be historical elements involved in sort of the democratic process, as there's, I mean, certainly pedigree matters in democratic theory. But what matters principally to the alleged authority of democratic institutions over those who are subject to them is the nature of the institutions, their structure, their goodness.
Right. I understand it. My thought was just that those who you say ignore history might say, well, we can incorporate that into a broader notion of structure. Namely, there is a certain structure, just as the structure should be for the acquisition of territory, something of that sort. And it would incorporate this historical element, just as the democratic structure incorporates a certain historical element. That's just was the idea, that they might respond in that way.
Uh-huh. I'm not sure that I see a convincing way to do that, but maybe that's possible. You had another
Yeah, the second
point.
was
The other
just about preempting. You actually,
Right. Okay.
kidnapped, but you would have exactly.
Okay, so I kidnapped this guy and forced him to be a member of my club. You would have been entitled to do what? Kidnap this person instead and make them a member of the club?
No, it would have been permissible for us, all right, to incorporate
To
this
incorporate
person,
that person.
right? It's just that as a matter of fact, I don't know, maybe some rogue member of our group actually incorporated them in a way that they shouldn't have. Now, I'm not sure whether it's the actual or the counterfactual permissible that would otherwise have occurred, let's say, at the same exact time, and gone, whether it makes it the case that we cannot say that, they're legitimately part of our group. How important is the actual as opposed to, there being a legitimate counterfactual?
Well, I hope it's very important. That is, I hope the actual the actual conduct of individuals and states is what matters with regard to right and wrong, not what would have been okay if things had been different.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure I'd want to say that I don't have rights over this person when, it was properly the case that I ought to have simply because there was a rogue member who acted prior to my acting properly.
Yeah, can you help me see how this distinction would be relevant to the kinds of cases that I have in mind?
No, I probably can't, because all I'm thinking about is this issue about actual, just as I was thinking about historical versus structural, actual versus, the only contrast is not structural. There might be, counterfactual, permissible ways of bringing these people into subjecthood or something of that sort.
But presumably you're not uncomfortable with the idea that it would be wrong for me to kidnap you and exercise coercive influence over you in various, just because it would be okay for him to.
No, absolutely. But you emphasize the important issue for the Kantian as well was they could recognize the wrong, but whether the wrong undermined the legitimacy of the authority. And so my comparable question is, if a rogue member actually did something wrong, should he not only be punished, but it should be the case that we would cede authority when we properly could have had it.
Yeah.
If we hadn't been preempted by someone who's not acting as our agent, acting improperly.
Right. That sounds right. I mean, if there are good arguments to that conclusion for the Kantian that others would have been entitled to impose authority on them had people not illegitimately imposed authority on them, if there's a good argument for that, then it seems to me that it's a natural way to open up the debate again. I don't think that's going to apply in most of the kinds of cases that I have in mind, but I could be wrong.
That's a real world fact. I'm not responsible for the real world. Sorry.
Well, I'm a philosopher, for God's sake, too.
So in a way, I think I want to just pick up on that very last point. And because it looks to me like your argument depends crucially on this intuition that you have that when a wrong has been committed, and if the wrong committed is a precondition of the state having authority over these people, that in a way is meant to undermine the state's claim to authority. Right. So the fact that the state committed wrong occupying this territory is meant to cancel its claim to authority over its occupants. I'm just wondering whether the intuition is quite as obvious as you make it out to be, especially once you specify it more carefully. So consider sort of a version of the case that Francis just raised. Imagine somebody has kidnapped me when I was a child and brought me to the US. I might have been wronged in the process. So if a wrong was committed, I'm only subject to the authority of US law because a wrong was committed. Still looks to me like I'm in exactly the same situation vis-a-vis vis-a-vis US law as any other ordinary US citizen. At least that's my intuition on these cases, right?
Yeah.
So that suggests it matters a lot.
You're playing into my game here.
Right, so it matters a lot if who commits the wrong, right? But now here's the next question. Couldn't somebody try and just resist your intuition about the Mexico case, so the US moving the border, by saying something like this? It's true that the US committed a wrong by occupying the Mexican territory. But crucially, the duties that you have to obey the law are not best specified as duties that are themselves owed to the US, but rather they're duties owed to your fellow citizens, as if you're a fellow subject of the US law. And if that's so, then if the thought that a wrong was committed that undermines this claim to obedience, that is, that undermines your obligation to obey the law, doesn't look quite as obvious anymore, because it looks like if the person committing the wrong and the person whom you would be wronging if you disobeyed the law are potentially two different people. Just as, the fact that I was wronged when I was dragged on this plane doesn't mean that now when the plane crashes, I have no duty to my fellow passengers trying to save them or trying to take care of them. So couldn't somebody try and just resist your intuition about these cases?
I'm not inclined to think so in the last example that you gave. That is, the fact that presumably, if what we're talking about is justified authority, presumably the fact that you were dragged on the plane would limit the kinds of authority that people could legitimately exercise over you on the plane. That doesn't mean that you'd be entitled to bring the plane down by hysterical means, because you have standing duties to other people not to wrong them in such ways. But surely it would wouldn't you think it would limit the airline's authority over you, say, if it dragged you kicking and screaming onto the plane rather than collecting your money as you...
But I mean, the worry is that it looks to me like imagine now the plane crashes.
Yeah.
It now looks like you have obligations to your fellow citizens, fellow passengers, quite independently of the reasons
Right.
that brought you onto this plane.
And the question in Estlin's example is whether or not the flight attendant has authority in those circumstances, right? And his argument is she does have authority. I'm not inclined to think that she does. I'm inclined to think that she is a natural focus for all of our efforts to do the right thing, to aid those in need. And so that it might be perfectly reasonable for us to comply with her demands without supposing that she's acquired authority over us in those circumstances.
But does that argument just depend on a fairly fine structural point, namely that you want to resist the idea that you could owe obedience to her, even though you might think it could be true that you have a duty to do as she says, that that's not a duty owed to her, just a duty owed to the other people?
Yeah, maybe that's a fine structural point. It seems to me an important fine structural point, though. I mean, the difference between doing as the law specifies because doing so is morally right, and doing as the law specifies because you owe it as an obligation to the state or your fellow citizens, as a part of a generic obligation to obey the law, seems to me an interesting difference. Does it not?
But there is, but it looks like there's a third option, right? You have a duty to do as the law says because the law says so, but the obligation isn't owed to the law, but it's owed to your fellow citizens.
Yeah.
Right? So that'd be the third option. It looks to me like that still doesn't fall prey to the worry that you're raising.
Okay, I'm still not sure. I'm still not positive I see how this is supposed to work, because if the state is supposed to be acting as the agent of this body of citizens, then presumably the body of citizens has wronged the former residents of Mexico just as straightforwardly as the state did when I was busy personifying it. No?
Arthur Applebaum.
What you see as a bug, I think the Kantians and the Rawlsians would see as a feature. They're changing the question. So in early social contract theory, transitional moments were really important. Locke wanted to answer the question, well, how do you get a political society started? And how do you join? And how do you leave? And Kant comes along, maybe Rousseau, but certainly by the time of Kant, they come along and says, well, let's not ask that question. Let's ask a different question. You wake up in the morning, you're surrounded by a political society, and what could make this legitimate to me? That doesn't mean that they ignore or say these transitional questions are irrelevant. It's just that they're starting from a different spot. It's very clear in Kant. So Kant on property. Instead of asking what everyone else before him asked, which is how do you acquire property, Kant says, okay, suppose there is property. What kinds of features does property have to have? Later, I'll talk about how you acquire property. And when he gets to revolution, he shows his hand, right? So there are transitional moments that require our attention, but let's not start there. Let's address the transitional questions after. What's the advantage of proceeding in this way? What's the advantage is that you actually are then you're open to the idea that maybe the transitional questions are not central, but rather they are add-ons that you have to address, but they don't drive the entire theory. And you've already given some suggestions about how that actually could be the case. So certainly if 1,000 years have passed, we don't see the problems of transition of foundings to be important. Yes, borders are arbitrary, we all understand that, but if for thousands of years we've been living in a just democratic political society, these things fade away. If I've just been kidnapped, then of course it's just like Kant on revolution. No, I'm being wronged, absolutely, and I could respond to it. So we need a point where this fades, right? We need a point where we no longer need transitional rules. There's another by analogy, only by example. So you suggested it. So Rawls on distributive justice, structural account of distributive justice. It's no argument against Rawls that if you wanted to implement the difference principle today, you'd have to take a lot of stuff away from people. He says that's the wrong question. I'm not answering that question. My question is if you wake up in the morning and you're surrounded by economic justice, what would that be like? And it would be something like the two principles of justice. It doesn't give us any clue about how you could move there. Right? That would require some more operation, but it's not a defect in his account of distributive justice that he hasn't told us how you get there. Similarly, it's not a defect. I don't think it's a defect in an account of political legitimacy that the theory doesn't give you organically the transition rules of how you get there. So what I think you're asking for are transitional rules. The Rawlsians and the Kantians need to give them to you. Some of them are kind of obvious, which is 1,000 years, don't worry. Immediately now you can fight back. One obvious, which has been suggested already, one obvious focal point is, well, when you're dead, and your children who have been brought up, who have been born into a perfectly democratic and just state, don't have the same historical complaint. That's only one possible way. There may be others. But I don't see that the absence of a well-worked out theory of transition in any way kills off the main part of the theory.
See, I don't see it as a theory of transition at all. I disagree with you about what I'm asking for. What I'm asking for is a theory of the scope or extent, the boundaries of the authority in the first place. And it seems to me that you and I may read Kant differently also, I think, because Kant, in the end, of course, says that that no matter how bad your circumstances, you're not entitled to resist with political violence, right?
Well, you're not entitled to resist a legitimate state, and of course it's an open question how you fill that in.
That's right.
Right.
That's
At
right.
least the Kantians.
And he had a very different
the Kantians
conception of a
are open about
legitimate state than contemporary Kantians do. I recognize that. But presumably, I'm not quite sure that I see why what you're saying doesn't just amount to putting a negation sign in front of my paper. That is, rather than it constituting an argument against it. Because I understand that you might think that what really matters is what it would be like to live in a just society, right? But a theory of authority goes along with that in Rawls, right? The theory of authority and the theory of political duty that goes along with that says that when just institutions apply to us, we have a duty to support and comply with those institutions. That's the Kantian position throughout, right? That's Kant's position too, provided that you're subject to a legitimate state.
So,
right, no matter how you came to be subject to the legitimate state, your duties are the same, and that's the central intuition that I'm challenging. That is, why would we think that your duties would be the same if you were kidnapped and granted membership in a legitimate state, and if you were born into a legitimate state? I mean, we might think that neither party is subject to the legitimate authority of the state merely by birth or by being kidnapped. But let's assume that everybody agrees. I mean, I'm in a distinct minority here, so let's assume that everybody agrees that the native born are uncontroversial, right? It does seem to me that it would be very, very odd to suggest that the person who is kidnapped and forcibly incorporated into that group has precisely the same obligations with respect to it and is subject to precisely the same authority, regardless of how he came to be.
It would indeed be very odd, but I think that Kant himself would probably say, well, this is a situation where, let's say, a revolution is actually happening. You don't know. We're in a legitimacy-free zone. Everything's up in the air.
But that's not
when it gets settled, then you owe obedience to the fellow who has managed to establish
But that's precisely not what Kant says, isn't it? I mean, it's not what Rawls. I mean, look, there's nothing in Rawls' ideal theory, right, which suggests that how one came to be subject to just institutions matters to the authority of those institutions over you, right?
When you're no longer in a situation where you're in a stable, legitimate state, which is what a revolution can provoke. I'm not talking about the revolutionary, but suppose there it is, you weren't part of a revolution, but now there's a revolution happening. All bets are off. Anyway, I'm taking up too much of your time. But
You can take more. I don't care.
The fact that a theory is silent about your questions doesn't mean that it's denying the importance of your question, right? It's simply asking a different question, and of course saying that the different question is more important. That's what I think the Kantians are saying.
Well, it looks like the Kantians are saying that's the only thing that's important. That's what this paper is denying, that it's the only thing that's important.
Yeah, I don't think either Rawls or Kant. Let me put it.
Well, where's their room?
Way, and I'll be real quick about it. So they're doing ideal theory, and you're asking questions in non-ideal theory, and they don't have a well worked out account of non-ideal theory. That doesn't mean they need one. They can see that they need one.
I took myself to be offering a different ideal theory. That is one which is more pluralistic and that takes into account such factors. But perhaps that looks like non-ideal theory to you.
Need I say we have a rich list here, so Min.
Thank you, Professor Simmons, for your excellent paper. I was really interested in your insight that, in your defense of historical theories of territory. In particular, I thought it was very interesting how you criticized Rawls for saying that the way borders are drawn is arbitrary, but you pointed out that they're not purely arbitrary. You know, why should the border between the US and Canada, for example, be drawn at a particular parallel? But rather, they can be unjust. So, for example, the US possessing Southern California, Arizona, parts of New Mexico is a result of a war which was unjust and not simply something that was arbitrary. Now, I wanted to ask you if we take seriously the fact that borders were drawn unjustly and that there might be a need for historical rectification. Who should determine how this historical rectification should take place, and who should make these duties authoritative to correct borders? So what I'm pushing you here on is asking you if there's actually a closer parallel between the state of nature between persons and the state of nature between states. And just as an authoritative government is needed to make definitive the duties of, for example, historical rectification between individuals and their holdings, whether there's a need for a government between states, a world state, in order to make definitive the duties of rectification for historical injustice.
Right. It seems to me that the answer to your question is either going to lie in a developed non-ideal theory, or it's going to lie in some sort of institutional theory, that is, a theory of the kinds of institutions that are necessary to fully realize people's rights. And that's probably also going to be part of non-ideal theory in the way that I conceive of non-ideal theory. And I don't think there is an easy answer to the question as a result. I mean, questions of non-ideal theory are not ones that on which I think anybody has a terrifically good handle, that is, any kind of simple formula that can be applied. We have various dimensions in non-ideal theory that we know are going to have to be satisfied, but I don't think the answer is... So the suggestion you were making, I take it, was that nations won't be able to settle such conflicts themselves, and so they'll need international bodies of some sort or other with the authority to settle those conflicts. And that might be right. But presumably that's a question of how best to approximate the ideal that I was arguing for, namely an ideal that takes historical facts about how boundaries were established in the first place seriously, and doesn't just take the boundaries as facts in the world.
Matthias.
I'd like to go back to your example about Germany and France, very intriguing set of cases to think about territorial claims. So the context in which you were doing that is you were taking on this move that you here ascribe to Waldron, that effective exercise of justice has, to put it vaguely, has a lot to do with territorial claims. That's actually that position strikes me as quite plausible, and this move, the Germany-France example, I don't think really refutes that, and here's why. I think a lot of the action there is in thinking about what is involved in effective administration of justice here. Yeah? So suppose the Germans are doing this, right? They're taking over France and they're starting administering justice. Then presumably whatever they would be doing there would be quite far away from effectively administering that, right? So the smallest problem would be on the side of the administrators, that they might not be properly motivated to actually do that, but the bigger problems would be on the side of the occupied to actually comply with these new regulations. And this would amount to a lot of things. They would probably not seek out the new court system to settle disputes. They would not be interested in making contributions to a tax system, or more generally creating a social space, a legal space in which this could be happening. So the idea that as an occupier you could just come in and then start doing something that would count as administration of justice doesn't get you anywhere near effective administration of justice. So arguably, and admittedly then also drawing on broad empirical assumptions in the background here, effective administration of justice has a lot to do with at least broad compliance within society, right? So no effective administration without broad compliance. And that is especially true if we are thinking about what is being administered here, right? So we are say, if you're thinking about the Rawlsian context, the sort of thing that we are handing out here, the distribuendum, are primary goods, right? Social primary goods. So then they're not just, it's not just a dictatorship can hand out some, bits of bread and have some formally adequate trials. Maybe they want to do that, but we are talking about really primary goods like positions of power and rights and opportunities, and all that presupposes a lot of compliance to even have a space in which this can be exercised. So no effective administration without broad compliance, which also explains it gives a natural space to historical considerations. Right? Historical considerations have an interesting role to play here to explain certain circumstances under which there wouldn't be such compliance. But if a territorial regime changes and eventually a new regime comes in and they actually, they gradually start administering justice and they're serious about it, and eventually there is compliance, that's the superseding move, right? Eventually there is effective administration, then the complaint also ceases, right? Then the history has dropped out at that moment.
Uh-huh. Now, I take it your question assumes that that compliance has to come along with some kind of a commitment to membership. Is that the idea? So that, because I take it that what you found implausible about my critique of Waldron was that we can't imagine a case in which a territory is illegitimately subjected and in which the administration of justice could be effective, right? That what we would need is people's commitment to that political society to get effective administration of justice.
Well, the commitment to the administration of justice. So I don't want to talk about legitimacy of territory in at this stage, but what it takes to make the territorial claims legitimate is that people are okay with the way the system of justice is being administered. That constitutes the claim to territory, right? And that you're not having if you're just moving in and you are pushing an old system aside, right? Then people's hearts are not in this.
So, yeah, I guess I'm not sure how far you're trying to push this. So is the claim then that for the administration of justice to be effective, I have to regard myself as not wronged by the imposition of that system of justice?
Well, it's meant to put back the relevance of the effective administration of justice for territorial claims. Right? To say that this is actually, if not sufficient, pretty close to sufficient. That we can in fact effectively administer justice in a territory that gets us pretty close to a territorial claim.
I guess I don't.
And the weight of the argument really comes to the term effective. Yeah.
No, I see that. I guess I don't see it as very close to sufficient, because if I'm right, we can still very much regard ourselves as wronged while participating in the administration of justice, while utilizing the courts in a society that has wrongfully imposed its authority on us and so on, can't we?
Well, it's logically possible. This is why I kind of said in quasi parentheses, you can, it's the
I would have thought it was more than logically possible, that it happens all the time, in fact.
Well, the idea that we are going along with the creation of a complicated social space that is required by having primary social goods as distribuendum, going along with that, making the administration of justice effective, but nonetheless have these reservations kind of deep down and say, well, we're just really not, we don't mean this. That that is the logical possibility, but given the way human beings function, what would be possibly what would be an interesting example where that sort of thing happened?
Where that sort of thing, I don't know. How about the Québécois?
Well, they want out, right?
What?
Many of them want out.
Yes, they want out. Let's suppose that they wanted out more than they actually do want out. That is, that they were more closely unanimous in this. And let's suppose that they were right in wanting out because they took their autonomy to have been wrongly stolen from them. This doesn't mean that they don't use the courts, that they aren't committed to obeying the laws that are enforced there. They're good people. They want their own state. Right? Because they were wrongly subjected to the authority of the Canadian national government. let's suppose that's true. It seems to me that that's just the kind of case that you're talking about, where you'd get effective administration of justice and there'd still be a wrong that seems to call for righting.
But it seems the kind of complaints that they're having are about the opportunities and rights that come with being a French speaker and things like that, and exercising French.
Yeah, well, there's a lively debate about exactly what justice requires in the way of language rights and things of that sort, so we probably shouldn't go there.
May I do a little grouping with Tim Scanlon and Johan Frick?
John, this is just a more textual version of Francis's first question and maybe a little bit of Matthias's. That is, it's an attempt to bring the historical within the structural.
Okay.
Take the case of your club first. I take it that, let's start with Rawls' natural duty of justice, right? That the first part of it says you have a natural duty to comply with just institutions where they exist and apply to you.
Right.
And you say, what do you mean apply, right? I've thought about that, and my thought is that the way he's got to try to get around that is to say for something to apply to you is for it to claim to apply to you, but then it also has to be just. And some claims to apply are not compatible with being just. Mm-hmm. So taking your club, the club doesn't come under Rawls' natural duty, but let's set that aside for the moment. The club can't claim to apply to just anybody and say that it wouldn't be just, right? Because the purposes of the club don't justify having those constraints, right? So that's the general pattern of the idea. Now, one thing, and the club also, in order to be just, has to allow people to drop out. You have to allow people to quit. But we don't think, in the case of the state, at least I don't think, that in order to be just, a state has to allow any of us to drop out without moving anytime we want. To say, oh, sorry, I'm not part of this anymore, because there are justifications having to do partly with locality, adequate administration of the law, as Matthias says, which count against that. But a constitution that also that said you can arbitrarily enlarge the number of people. You can declare that you're covering a whole new group of people, and you don't have to give them any say in it. That's unjust. Now, actually, I go to bed many nights hoping that I'll wake up in the morning and find that we've been annexed by Canada. But so far it hasn't happened. But even though it would be a good thing, I can see that the Canadian Constitution might not be just if it allowed them to do that. Constitutions do contain provisions about how new things can become part of it. And if our Constitution said we could suddenly declare that Paris is part of our Paris, France, is part of our, then it would be unjust. We don't have a just-like thing. So, and back in the beginning, there were ratification clauses. How is this thing going to get going? It's going to get going to apply to this area, provided that it's accepted by 2/3 of the people within a certain period of time, and so on and so on. And if that had included, if it had just those rules, but it said, and if it's enacted, then it also applies to all the citizens of Paris, that would have been unjust. Structurally, right? So this is an attempt to try to follow, give more detail to Francis's idea that
the historical considerations are already built into the theory of justice to begin with.
That's right. And where we're actually talking about a group of people who are simply born into something, whether their ancestors maybe were treated unfairly or not, there's a reparations issue there. But if I'm born into it and I have the options to opt out and move if I want, that I'm owed, then that's enough. Now, maybe it's also a requirement of justice that if my ancestors were treated unfairly, then I have to opt out without moving. But that's not that I have a right to opt out without moving. But that's not so obvious to me. But that would be a question of justice, you might say.
Mm-hmm. Structural we go question. To the next one and then group them together.
Okay. If I can answer them together, I'll try.
Yeah, I think because you were following up, Johan, on Matthias as well.
It's to follow up on Arthur and some of what Tim just said. Most people alive today, even members of Aboriginal groups and secessionist groups, were not in their own lifetimes annexed into another state. And that in the case of Aboriginal groups, the descendants of people who are annexed.
Most, not all.
But being born into a state, into a just state, might seem to us quite a different thing from being annexed by an otherwise just state. And perhaps in the former case, a largely structural account of authority does seem adequate. So I just wonder how far this kidnapping case or the annexation case really goes in undermining an otherwise structural account. Don't we just wipe the slate blank after one generation when people start to be born in our just state?
I think there are very interesting questions that have not been even remotely answered concerning what Waldron calls the supersession of rights. That is, what is the mechanism by which rights are, for instance, transmissible between generations. Rights to rectifications of various wrongs are transmissible between generations, and the extent, sort of what the conditions are under which rights simply go away. And I think that's an interesting subject for inquiry, and I think it's a subject on which, frankly, nobody has anything very clever to say. I think it's a really hard topic. So I agree that that's a good place to start. Let's see. Now I'm trying to answer Tim's question too. So if the idea is that the sort of pluralism I'm arguing for is actually built into the theory to begin with, then I guess my complaint is that Kantians sure don't talk as if that's the case. At least the Kantians that I'm reading. And Rawls, let's be fair, Rawls doesn't talk as if that's the case, does he? I don't, maybe, well, look, it'd be silly for me to have an argument about Rawls.
He doesn't address
with
the
you.
question of what is it for something to apply to you. So I think I think he would imagine, well, there are rights of secession, rights of withdrawal, that would be part of the basic liberties. But he doesn't actually address it, your question.
Yeah, okay. And if that kind of pluralism is built...
I'm not a Kantian. That's
Sorry?
right. I'm not a Kantian.
No, but I don't want to... I don't want to argue about what Rawls said with you. But in any event, if that kind of pluralism is built into the theory, then I've got no issue with the theory. It's just that it doesn't look like that's at work in most of the Kantian political philosophy that I read.
We should thank Don for a wonderful lecture.